All right, so today we're really getting into some of the fundamentals, the essential building blocks of Microsoft Azure.
Yeah, the core stuff, the base upon which everything else sits.
Exactly, Azure Cloud Architecture. And for this deep dive, we're turning to a great source, Bossil's Knowledge Bunker.
Oh, those guys are good. Super practical stuff.
Yeah, their whole theme is giving IT back, which I love.
It's about sharing knowledge, right? Not hoarding it. In this deep dive, we're going to break down this presentation we've got here.
It's full of actionable insights. It's all about maintaining that control, setting up a solid governance framework.
And, of course, managing your Azure resources effectively. And the real stars of the show, policies and role-based access control. We'll be unpacking all of that as we go through these slides. Ready to jump in.
Absolutely, let's get started.
All right, slide 1. It's our intro slide, just sets the stage for everything we're going to be talking about today.
Azure administration, with a real emphasis on governance and resource management. It's like the foundation of a well-run Azure setup.
And what I really like about this presentation is that it doesn't just tell you what these tools are, it actually dives into how to use them, so you can walk away with a practical understanding.
Right. It's about moving beyond just knowing the terms. It's about understanding how they all fit together to create a comprehensive and well-governed cloud environment.
Okay, let's move on to slide 2. Policy definitions and initiative management.
Yeah, this is where we start getting into the nuts and bolts of how you set the rules for your Azure environment.
Now, it might sound a bit technical, but bear with us. It's not as complicated as it might seem at first glance.
Right, so Azure policy definitions. The presentation mentions they follow a specific JSON format. Now, don't worry, you won't be writing JSON code all day.
No, thank goodness for that.
The Azure portal has a pretty user-friendly interface for managing policies.
Yeah, no need to be a coding whiz here.
But it is helpful to understand that there's a structure behind it all. Kind of like knowing a building has a blueprint, even if you're just using the rooms.
That's a great analogy. Okay, so then we've got these initiative definitions. What are those all about?
Think of those as like bundled packages of related policies. Instead of assigning a ton of individual policies, you can just create one initiative that covers a specific area, like security best practices.
Oh, so it's like a prepackaged set of rules.
Exactly. And there's currently a limit of 100 policies per initiative, just to give you an idea of the scale.
Wow, that's a lot of policies. So then how do you actually decide where these policies apply?
That's where scoping comes in. You assign an initiative to a specific subscription. That means these policies govern everything within that subscription.
Got it. So it's like setting boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. And you can get even more specific if you need to. You can target particular resource groups within that subscription for more granular control.
Oh, that makes sense. So you can tailor your policies to fit different parts of your Azure environment.
Precisely. That way you can make sure they're effective and relevant without being too broad or missing key areas.
All right, let's move on to slide 3, monitoring policy compliance. We've set our policies, bundled them up into initiatives, defined where they apply, but how do we actually know if things are following the rules?
This is where that compliance blade in the Azure portal comes in. You can find it through the Azure Policy widget.
So it's like a central dashboard for keeping an eye on things.
Yep, you can see which initiatives and policies are compliant and which ones aren't, even down to the individual resource level.
So it's like a report card for your Azure resources.
Exactly. And the way it works is when a resource doesn't adhere to a policy, it gets flagged as non-compliant.
So you can see right away what needs attention.
Yeah. And the cool part is that this evaluation happens pretty frequently, about every hour, so you get quick feedback if you make any changes.
Oh, wow, that's pretty fast. So you don't have to wait forever to see if your changes are working.
Exactly. It's super helpful for keeping your cloud environment healthy and well-governed.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about who can do what in our Azure environment. Slide 4, RBAC overview. Role-based access control. This sounds super important for security.
It's absolutely critical. RBAC is all about managing access to your cloud resources. Just like in any organization, you need to control who can access and modify sensitive information.
It's all about permissions, right?
Right. And RBAC gives you that fine-grained control over who can do what with which resources. It's not just a blanket access, it's very specific.
So you're not just giving someone the keys to the kingdom.
Nope. You're giving them the key to just the specific room they need to be in.
I like that. Makes things a lot more secure. And what's really interesting here is that This RBAC system is built right into Azure Resource Manager.
Yeah, it's baked right in. That means access control is a core part of how Azure operates.
So it's not an afterthought, it's built into the foundation.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so powerful. You can really segregate duties within a team and make sure everyone only has the access they need.
Which is huge for security and reducing risk, right?
Absolutely. You're adhering to the principle of least privilege. Give people the minimum access they need to do their jobs.
Makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's dive into the details of how RDAC works. Slide 5 breaks down the key concepts. We've got security principles, role definitions, scope, and role assignments.
All right, let's start with security principles. This is any entity that needs to be authenticated and authorized to access Azure resources.
So we're talking about users, groups, service principals, and managed identities.
Exactly. Users are your everyday folks. Groups are collections of users. Service principals are non-human identities used by apps. And managed identities are a way for Azure services to automatically authenticate.
So all the different players in your Azure environment, and we've got role definitions. What's their purpose?
Think of a role definition as a blueprint for permissions. It lays out exactly what actions a security principal can perform.
So it's like a job description for your Azure resources.
Kind of. The slide lists some common built-in roles like reader, contributor, owner, and user access administrator. Each one has its own set of permissions.
So reader can only view stuff, contributor can manage most things, owner has full control, and user access administrator is all about managing who has access to what. Got it.
Exactly. And you can even create custom role definitions for even more specific needs.
Okay, that's really flexible. What about scope? How does that fit in?
Scope defines the boundaries of where a role's permissions apply. It could be at the top level, like a management group.
Which, remember, is a way to organize multiple subscriptions.
Right. Or it could be at the subscription level, a resource group level, or even down to a single resource.
So you can get really granular with your permissions.
Exactly. You could give someone contributor rights to just one specific database without giving them access to anything else.
That's pretty impressive. And lastly, we've got role assignments. What happens there?
This is where we actually link a specific role definition to a security principle at a particular scope.
So we're putting all the pieces together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're saying this user with this role can do these actions within this specific area.
And just as importantly, you can remove a role assignment to revoke access. So it's all very controlled and auditable.
It's like giving someone a key card that only opens certain doors in a specific building. Take the card away, and they can't get in anymore.
Perfect analogy. Now that we understand the basics, let's move to slide 6 and talk about RBAC best practices. This is where it gets real, right? How do we actually use RBAC effectively?
The first best practice is all about segregating duties. This means separating responsibilities within teams based on job functions.
So different people have different levels of access depending on their role.
Exactly. This prevents anyone from having too much control, which helps reduce the risk of both accidental errors and malicious actions.
Makes sense. What's next?
Next is the principle of least privilege. We touched on this before, but it's worth emphasizing. Only grant the minimum access necessary to get the job done.
Don't give people more access than they need. Got it.
Right. And then we have coordinating roles. This is all about carefully considering the permissions included in each role and making sure they align with the specific tasks and responsibilities of the user.
So it's not just randomly assigning roles, it's about being strategic and thoughtful.
Exactly. And finally, don't forget to periodically audit your role assignments. Organizations change, people change roles, and permissions need to be updated accordingly.
It's like spring cleaning for your access control.
Exactly. You need to keep things tidy and make sure no one has unnecessary access.
Okay, slide 7 tackles a common point of confusion. The difference between Azure RBAC roles and Azure AD administrator roles.
Yeah, this is important to understand. Azure RBAC roles are specifically for managing Azure resources themselves. Things like virtual machines, databases, storage accounts.
Okay, so if I need someone to be able to start and stop a virtual machine, I'd use an Azure RBAC role for that.
Right. And those roles can be either built in or custom, and you can assign them in different scopes.
So I could give someone access to just one specific VM, or to all the VMs in a resource group.
Got it. Now, what about Azure AD administrator roles? What do they do?
Azure AD administrator roles are all about managing Azure Active Directory. So things like creating users, managing groups, configuring domain settings. It's about managing identities.
So if I need someone to be able to reset passwords or create new user accounts, I'd use an Azure AD administrator role.
Exactly. And there are a number of different admin roles within Azure AD, each with its own set of permissions.
So these two systems work together, but they manage different aspects of the Azure environment. RBAC is for the resources themselves, and Azure AD is for the identities.
Precisely. They complement each other to provide comprehensive authentication and authorization.
Authentication being proving who you are, and authorization being what you're allowed to do once you're in.
Exactly. And the slide also mentions classic subscription administrator roles. They're like the older, less flexible way of managing access. RBAC is definitely the way to go now. It's the modern approach. Okay, let's move on to slide 8 and look at some of those fundamental built-in RBAC roles. Starting with the big one, owner. What can they do?
The owner role has full access to all resources within its scope. They can create, modify, delete anything. And crucially, they can also delegate access to others by assigning RBAC roles.
So they're like the king or queen of their little Azure domain.
Exactly. They have ultimate control. And at the subscription level, the legacy roles of service administrator and co-administrators basically map to the owner role.
So it's a powerful role. What about contributor? How do their permissions differ?
Contributor can also create and manage most Azure resources, but they can't grant access to others.
So they can't manage the stuff, but they can't decide who else gets to manage it.
Precisely. And both owner and contributor roles apply to all resource types.
Makes sense. What about reader? That sounds pretty self-explanatory.
Yep, reader can view existing resources, see their configuration and status, but they can't make any changes.
So it's a read-only role.
Exactly. Super useful for auditing, troubleshooting, or just getting a sense of what's going on without the risk of breaking anything.
Absolutely. And lastly, we've got user access administrator. What's their specialty?
They are the gatekeepers of access control. They manage who has what permissions by assigning RBAC roles.
So they're not necessarily managing the resources themselves, but they're managing who gets to manage them.
Exactly. It's a key role for separating duties and making sure the right people have the right access.
And that brings us to our final slide, slide 9, resource management best practices. This is about more than just policies and RBAC.
Right. There are a bunch of other practices that contribute to a well-run Azure environment.
Starting with implement tagging. We hear about tagging all the time, but why is it so important?
Think of tags as labels you put on your resources to categorize them. You can tag them by department, project, environment, cost center, anything that's relevant to your organization.
So it's like adding metadata to your resources.
Exactly. And that makes it much easier to manage and track them. You can filter resources by tag, allocate costs accurately, and even apply policies based on tags.
So it's a way to organize your Azure world and get a clear picture of what you have.
Precisely. Then we have using management groups. These are a way to group your subscriptions hierarchically.
Yeah, we talked about those earlier when discussing scope.
Right. And by using management groups, you can manage policies, access control, and budgets across multiple subscriptions at once.
That's super efficient for larger organizations.
Exactly. And it ensures consistency across your cloud environment. Then there's setting spending thresholds with alerts. This is all about staying on top of your costs.
Make sure you're not accidentally spending a fortune in the cloud.
Right. Azure lets you set budgets and configure alerts, so you'll be notified if you're approaching or exceeding your limits.
And essential for keeping your finances in check. Then we have assigning granular permissions, which we already discussed in depth with RBAC and least privilege.
Exactly. It's all about granting the minimum access necessary, especially at the resource level.
And then applying resource locks. What are those for?
Resource locks are a safety net to prevent accidental deletion or modification of important resources. You can lock a resource so it's read-only or so it can't be deleted at all.
Like a big red button that says, "Don't touch."
Pretty much. Really useful for protecting mission-critical stuff.
And the slide also reminds us about a few other things. Consistently implementing best practices, remembering that resources can only be in one resource group at a time, understanding that resource groups can't be nested, and applying RBAC at the resource group level.
All important considerations for keeping your Azure environment organized and secure.
And lastly, there's using resource manager templates for deploying and managing infrastructure. How do those fit in?
Resource Manager templates are a way to define your infrastructure as code. It's a more programmatic approach, using a JSON format.
So you're writing code to define your cloud resources.
Exactly. And this allows for consistent and repeatable deployments. You can spin up resources with the exact same configuration every time.
That sounds super efficient and eliminates human error.
It does. And it also makes things easier to manage and audit because your infrastructure is defined in code.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We've really gone deep on Azure governance and resource management.
Policies, initiatives, RBAC, management groups, resource locks, tagging, templates. We've touched on it all.
And the takeaway here is that being proactive about implementing these tools and best practices is crucial for maintaining control of your Azure environment.
It's not just a nice to have, it's essential for security, compliance, and cost optimization.
Absolutely. And remember, it's an ongoing process. You're always learning and improving your Azure management practices.
So as you think about your own Azure environment, what's one thing you can start doing differently today? Maybe implement more granular RBAC, use tagging more effectively, or explore management groups.
Or maybe take a closer look at your current role assignments and make sure they follow the principle of least privilege.
Lots of opportunities to level up your Azure game.
And as you continue your Azure journey, remember that a solid understanding of these fundamental concepts will make you a more confident and capable cloud administrator.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive. We'll be back with more Azure explorations in the future. Until then, happy cloud managing.